Hello again, everyone. So for this video, picking up on the theme of our last video, we're going to look at the origins of America's in deepening involvement in Vietnam. Now, the first video we kind of looked at, sort of the preliminaries of how the United States began to first off take an interest in what initially was referred to as Indochina, after 1954 is referred to as Vietnam. And basically, where we left off, the situation was that by 1961, by the time that Dwight Eisenhower leaves office and he is succeeded by John F. Kennedy in January of 1961, the situation in South Vietnam, the Republic of South Vietnam, was that the U.S. was backing a increasingly repressive, increasingly unpopular, increasingly corrupt regime under Ngo Dinh that was facing a mounting insurgency that formally referred to itself as the National Liberation Front, but which informally came to be known and would be known primarily to American servicemen who fought there as the Viet Cong. Now, at the same time that this insurgency is mounting, the U.S. had by this point sent around 900 or so advisors to South Vietnam, who were there primarily to perform a non-combat mission, training the army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN for short, under Diem's regime. The problem was, by this point, the situation is getting pretty dicey for Diem and for his regime. It's pretty clear that they aren't doing as well at containing this insurgency as one would hope. And so when Kennedy becomes president, first off, as we've mentioned in class previously, Kennedy is a fierce Cold Warrior, and so he wants to combat and challenge the Soviet Union as directly and as vigorously as he can. This ultimately leads to a series of escalating confrontations with the Soviet Union that, of course, culminate in the near nuclear apocalypse of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy walks away from the Cuban Missile Crisis looking pretty good in the eyes of the American people and indeed of much of the world after a pretty rocky start in the first few months of his presidency. But the Cuban Missile Crisis teaches a larger lesson to Kennedy and to many American political, military, and economic advisors. And that lesson is fundamentally that direct confrontation with the Soviet Union and with the, again, very broadly defined idea of international communism that people are still operating under at this time, he realizes, and his team of advisors recognize, that a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union is tantamount to suicide, and would likely lead to both countries facing off in a nuclear exchange that could potentially kill all human life on Earth, basically, nuclear Armageddon. So that's not an attractive option, to put it mildly. And so, both before but especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, the Kennedy administration begins looking at alternative ways of combating the Soviet Union. Now, publicly, the Kennedy administration is pursuing a somewhat of a détente strategy with the Soviet Union. An early version of arms reduction in the form of the 1963 Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. But behind closed doors, Kennedy is still determined to wage a aggressive containment of the Soviet Union and of communism on whatever front it presents itself. And Vietnam, in many ways, provides the exact sort of opportunity for testing out a new theory that many in his cabinet and many military leaders that surrounded him in the Joint Chiefs of Staff had advocated. Kennedy surrounds himself with a team of uh, well-known figures from academia and from big American corporations, as well as well-known military figures like General Maxwell Taylor and General Curtis LeMay of the Strategic Air Command. And what these advisors, his whiz kids, as they come to be known, they all agree on a basic premise that the United States cannot afford to cede any ground to communism, that it cannot afford to cede any ground in this international arena to communist aggression. Mind you, they're not looking at the war in Vietnam as it in fact actually is, which is basically a civil war and, depending on your viewpoint, a war for independence for the people of Vietnam. They're viewing it in the context of the Cold War and the Soviet Union and Red China and all that sort of stuff. And so they fully embrace the domino theory that President Dwight Eisenhower had articulated in 1954. This belief that if you allow communism to take root in South Vietnam, if you allow South Vietnam to fall to communist aggression, then it will likely spread like a pathogen and knock over the states of Southeast Asia like a row of dominoes in rapid succession, leaving the United States diplomatically, militarily, and politically isolated in the Far East. And so this becomes, kind of it becomes the default thinking, the conventional wisdom, if you will, of many of Kennedy's closest advisors, people like his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, people like the Department of State's Strategic Planning Staff, Walt Rostow, his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, and the head of the Joint Chiefs, General Maxwell Taylor. All of these people pretty much embrace this idea wholeheartedly, and they encourage Kennedy to dramatically increase American involvement in South Vietnam. Now, this involvement in South Vietnam is designed to take two principal forms. The way that the Kennedy administration frames this to the American public, principally, is in the form of economic aid. Kennedy and many of his advisors, like Walt Rostow, believed in that basically they could curb international communism. They could curb the expansion of communism by essentially exporting the New Deal to other parts of the world, by engaging in infrastructure building hospitals, hydroelectric facilities, dams, things like that. And so they decide to invest a lot of American money in this sort of international economic aid to South Vietnam to build up its infrastructure, to weaken the insurgency of the Viet Cong, and to build a stable democratic society there. In theory, that's going to be what is the tip of the spear of the American effort to curb communism in South Vietnam, is this economic aid. A big part of that, of course, is programs like the Peace Corps, which send sizable numbers of college-educated and idealistic young Americans to places like South Vietnam and other third world countries, which again, in the context of the Cold War, means non-aligned countries, to engage in infrastructure projects, water purification, building schools and hospitals and that sort of thing. So that's what they state as the principal means that the U.S. is going to secure an independent and democratic South Vietnam, is through this sort of economic aid, this sort of, again, taking the New Deal and exporting it abroad. They figured if it worked in Western Europe with the Marshall Plan, it can work in places like South Vietnam. Um, the problem is that in actuality, the economic part, the butter, if you will, is always secondary to the guns in this plan to stabilize and, you know, beat back the insurgency in South Vietnam. Much more money is spent on arming and equipping the Army of the Republic of South Vietnam, the ARVN, than is spent on these economic programs. Much of that money is wasted because of the fact that the ARVN, like much of the rest of the South Vietnamese government, is thoroughly corrupt. Its officers are oftentimes appointed because they are close friends or reliable political allies of President Ngo Dinh Diem, rather than because they have a tough fighting spirit or anything else like that. And so that becomes in and of itself a major problem. The way that the US tries to compensate with this problem of endemic corruption within the Diem regime is to dramatically increase not just the quantity of American military equipment being sent to Vietnam to arm and equip the ARVN, but also to dramatically increase the number of American military personnel stationed there as advisors. This is part of a larger strategy devised by General Maxwell Taylor, who becomes the architect of Kennedy's Cold War strategy in the Third World. Taylor advocates what he calls a flexible response doctrine. And that flexible response doctrine involves primarily engaging in a counterinsurgency campaign using asymmetric warfare against the Viet Cong and others. And again, you know, this is designed to be a plan for fighting wars all over the world, but Vietnam is seen as an ideal testbed for this particular way of combating communist insurgencies. And so, to that end, the number of American military advisors dramatically increases during the Kennedy administration. And more, those American military advisors find themselves engaged in direct combat operations. They're supposed to be there to support the ARVN. They're not supposed to directly engage in combat. But as time goes on and as the insurgency gains strength, with supplies funneling in to South Vietnam through a path of jungle highways, mostly carved out of the neighboring states of Laos and Cambodia, that will come to be known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The insurgency itself begins to gain strength, and it gains strength for a number of reasons. It gains strength in spite of the increasing number of American military advisors, many of them members of newly created special forces units like the Green Berets, that are created quite specifically to train indigenous forces in American styles of warfare and to effectively combat the Viet Cong insurgency. In spite of the presence of these oftentimes elite American military advisor units, the ARVN begins suffering both increasing casualties and, in some instances, flat out defeats at the hand of the Viet Cong. And the reason for this is not only the increased tempo of supplies flowing south into South Vietnam via the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but also because the efforts of the American military advisors and their ARVN counterparts in particular actually increase the number of people who join the insurgency. Many of the features that would later make the war in Vietnam so controversial, once it becomes a fully Americanized conflict, first emerge during this time period. The Diem government, in an effort to weaken the insurgency, begins relocating entire villages of Vietnamese peasants out of their traditional villages that they and their families had lived in for hundreds of years, and relocating them to areas where they can be kept under close government supervision. They call this a strategy of pacification or strategic hamleting. They also begin using chemical defoliants, including Agent Orange, on the jungle to try to eliminate the hiding places that the Viet Cong insurgents use. Moreover, as part of these military efforts to fight the insurgency, oftentimes the ARVN forces, put simply, kill the wrong people. They go into villages looking for Viet Cong insurgents, and they end up killing innocent villagers who have nothing to do with the insurgency whatsoever, which actually means that more people, rather than less, are likely to join the insurgency. And many people who aren't sympathetic to communism, many people who aren't, particularly enamored with the government in Hanoi under Ho Chi Minh, end up joining the insurgency because they lose family members or friends. That's the difficulty with insurgencies. If you kill too many of the wrong people, you actually end up significantly multiplying the size of your enemies rather than decreasing them. And so it becomes, in many ways, this very sort of futile exercises. Insurgencies are very, very difficult to win for this reason. And so basically, because of the military efforts of the ARVN, the strategic hamleting program, the use of the widespread and, in many cases, flagrant use of deadly weapons like napalm, which is a jelly gasoline that then kind of creates a giant fireball and burns at about 4,000 degrees. You get large numbers of people who previously probably wouldn't have supported the Viet Cong, either actively joining the insurgency or indirectly supporting it in some mean way, shape, or form. And so all these things contribute to a declining situation in South Vietnam. Initially, in spite of this, because of the American technological superiority, the fact that the U.S. is able to provide helicopters and armor personnel carriers and things like that to the ARVN that the Viet Cong do not have, they enjoy the upper hand. But eventually, the Viet Cong figure out how to defeat these modern weapons and modern, things, and begin inflicting serious casualties. At the same time that all that is happening, the Diem government itself inflicts a series of crises upon itself that make its standing increasingly tenuous and increasingly frustrate President John F. Kennedy. He begins, a lot of autocratic moves. He uses public funds to promote Catholic instead of Buddhist holidays. And there end up being these mass protests in South Vietnam to protest the autocratic nature of his regime. One of the most famous of these ends with a Buddhist monk, sitting down in a busy intersection in Saigon, pouring gasoline on himself and then setting himself afire. A spectacle that is a gruesome spectacle that is then duplicated many times over the next several weeks. And so, as a result of what comes to be known as the Buddhist crisis in South Vietnam, Diem's leadership is increasingly in doubt. That, coupled with his mishandling of the military conflict against the Viet Cong, likewise weakens confidence in Washington, in his government. And so, in the autumn of 1963, with an increasing level of frustration directed at the Diem regime, President Kennedy gives the go-ahead to orchestrate a coup against Diem and his brother, who was the in charge of the South Vietnamese secret police. And this coup was carried out on November the 2nd, 1963. Now, Kennedy, when he gave the green light to the coup against Diem, he thought it would result in Diem being removed from power and exiled from the country. That doesn't happen. Instead, after Diem is toppled, he and his brother are both then summarily executed, assassinated. This deeply troubles Kennedy, and he immediately regrets his decision to authorize the coup against Diem. Ironically enough, of course, less than 3 weeks later, Kennedy himself would be assassinated in Dallas. And this brings us to the major historical question that, of course, has been on pretty much everybody's mind ever since Kennedy's assassination regarding the war in Vietnam. Would the war in Vietnam have continued to, would American involvement have continued to intensify had Kennedy lived? Or would he have cut his losses and pulled American forces out, recognizing that the political situation there was simply untenable and that victory was impossible, which was pretty much the consensus by the end of the Kennedy administration. By late 1963, early 1964, many American political and military leaders had basically come to the conclusion that a full victory in South Vietnam was impossible, and that a defeat was a much more likely outcome. Yet in the end, the United States opted not only to stay in the conflict, but under President Lyndon Johnson, the conflict would become a full-fledged American war by early 1965. And so, of course, again, the question is, would this have happened if John F. Kennedy had lived? Sadly, the answer in all likelihood is yes, it probably still would have happened. Would it have happened exactly the way that it did under Johnson? Probably not. But it is very likely that had Kennedy not been assassinated, had he lived, that the American involvement in Vietnam would have continued in some capacity at least, and probably would have continued to intensify. And a big part of the reason for this is because of the people who surrounded Kennedy. They were the same people who surrounded Lyndon Johnson, Secretary of State Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, General Maxwell Taylor. All these people that advised President Kennedy would also be advising Lyndon Johnson just a few months later when he assumed the mantle of the presidency following Kennedy's assassination. And their views didn't fundamentally change between the time of Kennedy's assassination and the time that Lyndon Johnson began escalating the war in Vietnam and turning it into an American war. So, as kind of dissatisfying as that may be, the likelihood is that in reality, had Kennedy lived, he probably would have continued on in Vietnam at least until the aftermath of the 1964 election. There's some evidence that had he won re-election in 1964, which was doubtful at the time, that he might have reconsidered. But we'll never know for sure. But all available historical evidence would tend to suggest that he would have continued American involvement in the conflict for at least another few years, if not longer. So that's basically where things are when Lyndon Johnson takes office. Now, after Lyndon Johnson takes office, this is obviously now a decidedly less than ideal situation. He didn't create the situation in Vietnam. He's basically inherited the situation from his predecessors, from John F. Kennedy and from Dwight Eisenhower. By the time that John F. Kennedy is assassinated, there are now 17,000 American military advisors in South Vietnam. And around 100 or so Americans have already died in combat operations in the country. So it's a delicate situation for him. And he pretty much faces an immediate choice when he becomes president. Um, After Kennedy's assassination, he can cut his losses and begin pulling American advisors and American economic and political aid out of the country and let the chips fall where they may, which in all likelihood would result in a communist victory and the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. Or he can dramatically up the ante of American involvement in a effort to try to at least stem the tide of communist advancement in the country. Now, again, by this point, most military advisors, most political advisors, they recognize that absolute victory, not going to happen. That, the chances of an absolute victory are remote at best. So at this point, Johnson, when he makes the decision to dramatically increase American involvement in the war, which he does just ahead of the 1964 presidential election in 1964, he's doing so primarily as a political choice. Primarily to avoid embarrassment. Johnson was terrified that if the United States withdrew from South Vietnam and South Vietnam then fell to communist forces, that he would, much like Harry Truman had been in 1949, be dogged by his Republican opponents as being weak on communism and be accused of having, quote, lost Vietnam. And so it's that pervasive fear of, being seen as the guy who lost Vietnam or being seen as weak on communism, which is almost a pathology with Democratic politicians during this time period. They're already attacked on their domestic side by their opponents for programs that are labeled socialistic. And so I think that because of the fact that the Democratic Party is the left party, comparatively speaking, in the United States, it's not by the standards of much of the rest of the world, but by American standards anyway. Because of that, they feel an even greater need to be seen as strong, during this period at least. They feel an even greater need to be seen as strong on containing communism. And so that, I think, is a very big part of that, is that fear of being tarred as weak on communism or, somehow less than fully committed to combating the Soviet Union and to fighting the Cold War. Now, the situation is pretty dire by the time Johnson assumes office. By the time he assumes office, Diem has already been assassinated and overthrown, and Vietnam increasingly is in chaos. Between November of 1963 and early 1965, there are more than a dozen coups and counter-coups in South Vietnam, a dozen new governments that form during this time period. So it's a very unstable period. And pretty much immediately, they come to this recognition that without a massive American intervention and a massive American military intervention, that South Vietnam is going to fall, and it's going to fall to communist forces. The problem, of course, is that most Americans don't want, at this point, to send American forces to South Vietnam. They don't want to extend America's role there beyond what it already is, which already many see as too much at this time period. So Johnson needs a rationale to justify that expanded American military role. He gets it in August of 1964, right as conveniently for him as he is in the midst of the 1964 presidential campaign. In early 1964, a American destroyer, a World War II era destroyer called the USS Maddox, is engaged in covert espionage activities off the coast of North Vietnam in support of the South Vietnamese Navy. While engaging in these activities, the Maddox is attacked on August the 2nd, 1964, by 3 North Vietnamese patrol boats. The attack doesn't result in any substantial damage. There's no meaningful damage to the destroyer. There's no loss of life, but the ship is fired upon and answers with return fire of its own. And so this is seen, or at least is portrayed by Johnson as a unjustified provocation by the North Vietnamese. A few days later, in the middle of a storm, the Maddox and another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, claimed to come under yet another North Vietnamese torpedo boat attack. Now, this second attack almost immediately is viewed suspiciously by people in government. There's no evidence that anybody had actually fired on the Maddox or the Turner Joy in this second skirmish, second alleged skirmish. And it's very quickly deduced that, in fact, no attack had actually occurred, that there was no second attack. The first one did, but the second one did not. And that was known pretty much immediately. But in spite of this, Johnson decides this is the moment that he needs to justify and excuse a dramatic increase in American military presence in South Vietnam. And so he announces the attacks publicly and demands a resolution from Congress for an unlimited expansion of American military force in Vietnam. He authorizes some airstrikes over targets in North Vietnam, which results in the first American pilots getting shot down, who would ultimately be held for almost 9 years. But he enjoys very broad public support for this stance. His approval ratings, which at the time, were kind of moderate, shoot through the roof. His strong response to the Gulf of Tonkin incident pretty much neuters the argument of his Republican opponent, Barry Goldwater, that he was weak on communism, and helps boost him in the 1964 election. Now, as a result of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, Johnson is able to persuade Congress to give him this expansive power to expand America's involvement in Vietnam, essentially without any guardrails whatsoever. It's known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution basically gives President Lyndon Johnson permission to wage carte blanche war in South Vietnam, a blank check, if you will. Johnson himself, in his typically crude fashion, compared the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution to Granny's nightshirt, saying it covers everything. And so the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution basically gives Johnson the authorization for military force he needs to dramatically escalate the American role in Vietnam. Now, initially, after the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is handed down, Johnson pledges the American people that this doesn't mean that he's going to turn Vietnam into an American war. He even goes as far as to say, again, in his decidedly less than politically correct manner, we're not going to send American boys to fight a war that Asian boys should be fighting for themselves. So, Johnson basically initially is able to get a lot of public support for this by, keeping that the plan to escalate American involvement to a minimum, at least not to say so publicly. But within a few months of the issuing of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, um, that is exactly what would happen. And within 6 months of the issuing of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, Johnson would feel compelled to take actions that would, by mid 1965, transform the war in Vietnam from a civil war and a war for unification and independence into an American war. Um, and a war that would ultimately uh, have massive effects on American society and America's reputation, both domestically and internationally. So that's where we're going to end this for today. When we get back, we'll look at what that escalation is and the effects that it eventually has on American society because of the way the war is fought.